here in Boza and online. It's my pleasure to open the third day of the European AI Week. So today we will have a keynote on digital economics, followed by a debate on how to get trained in AI. And at the beginning of the afternoon, we will have another debate on how to stay informed in the era of generative AI. So it's my pleasure to welcome on stage Nicolas Van Zeebroeck, Professor of Digital Strategy of the Solvay Brussels Schools of Economics and Management, that will present his new book on digital economics. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nathanael, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here or online. And it's indeed my pleasure to give you a TLDR of this book that was published a few months ago, which talks about digital economics in general, but I will also try to readily be a hint at some specificities of AI in this regard. So here is the book. It's in French. I hope I can bring a translation in English or in Dutch in the coming months, I hope. But in the meantime, one of the starting points was something like that, the idea that when you look at digital markets, it looks like it's always the same companies that seem to be winning the game, a little bit like one used to say about football with the German team always outperforming the other ones. And that was one first hint at something that seems peculiar to digital economics, which is very, very odd in the sense that at the root of digital, we have, of course, the internet. And with the internet, we had very high expectations and promises in terms of a world that would be free of a lot of intermediaries. The idea behind the World Wide Web was really, at the end of the day, something related to very universal, very open values, and potentially a universe where knowledge would be freely shared, and that would be a world of fraternity, free of big intermediaries. At the end of the day, it should be the starting point of a decentralized economy. And that's really at the heart of the internet, be it with the wealth of networks from Benkler or the Declaration of Independence of the cyberspace. This was the promise. But here's the trick. We were promised that the technology would finally offer us the end of private intermediaries and big companies controlling the world. That's because we have new technologies that enable people to be empowered, to give back the power to the end users, to the consumers, to the citizens, and therefore you have at least a way to unleash innovation, to decentralize innovation in a lot of ways, in the production of content and the diffusion of content, etc. The problem with that is that it creates a sort of a very complex situation in which content and services become completely messy, and it's very hard to find your way within this new space without intermediaries, and that creates an open space for new intermediaries to offer a solution to curate this massive content and to offer easy interfaces, easy access to this way. So we were promised originally that we would have this open World Wide Web, but we ended up with AOL and Google and Yahoo and Microsoft. And then we were promised, but now we have the Web 2.0. That will be now completely different with the Web 2.0. Finally, at last, this will be the open and the decentralized network, finally. But we ended up with social network platforms and with some of these big companies being even more powerful. And now, of course, we've been a few years ago, been promised the Web 3.0. That includes also the massive movement towards the blockchain and cryptocurrencies, etc. And again, what do you see? That if you look only at at the space of cryptocurrencies, for instance, that you end up again with big platforms like Binance or Coinbase that are, and now even the traditional finance that is taking a grasp on this so-called decentralized phenomenon. And so there seems to be something like the mice of Sisyphus, you know, that every time you try to push back the big intermediaries, and then they find a way to come back, which is nicely illustrated in this chart that reminds us of the capitalization of the big tech companies nowadays that is completely eclipsing the rest of the economy on the stock market, but also dwarfing, of course, the European stock market for that matter. And so the other way to look at this piece today is, of course, to look at the quasi-monopolistic situation of the big firms that everybody has in mind, be it Google with search, be it Apple with smartphone profit shares, be it, of course, Meta with social nets, and Amazon in general. But these are only some of the big winners of the game. Of course, now you can expand that to the Magnificent Seven, and even to some of the winners of the so-called platform economy, like Uber, Airbnb, and others. And then, of course, you have the Chinese equivalents, and then you have also some of those firms that are becoming very, very powerful as well, but less visible, like the data broker companies, etc. So it's more nuanced than only limiting yourself to the five major ones. But it seems nonetheless that on every market there seems to be one or two very dominant players, and we know that for Europe that's a bad position to be in, because at the end of the day most of these players are either Chinese or American, with the outcome that 92% of our data is essentially stored in US-owned infrastructures, and we know that most of the computing power for AI, for that matter, is hosted outside of Europe. And so that was the starting point. When you look at that, you figure there seems to be something that is peculiar to the way digital markets seem to work, and that gave me this envy, this desire to write in a book my own view on why that is, and why economic markets function fundamentally differently than others. It starts, of course, it boils down to five main mechanisms, but it starts, of course, with the mere idea that once you dematerialize products or services, for that matter, services or processes being dematerialized in the form of software and algorithms, and increasingly AI algorithms nowadays, what happens is that you go from a world of atoms and material and energy to a world of dematerialized information, i.e. bits of information, and bits of information are fundamentally different. And there are five main reasons to that. The first one, again, is once you dematerialize, what happens, again, be it products or processes, is that you enter a world where marginal costs of production disappear. If you compare my book on paper version versus the ebook version that you can, the EPUB version that you can get as well, the fundamental difference between the two is that the electronic version has no marginal cost associated to it. And what happens in economics once you get rid of the marginal cost of production? Well, basically what ends up is that the law of economies of scale mainly change dramatically. In a traditional world, in a world of atoms, of physical goods or physical products and services, once you grow in volumes, you have also to increase not just the variable cost, but even the base of fixed cost needs to increase once you cross a certain threshold. As a result, the average unit cost does not decline all that fast. It does decline, that's what we call economies of scale or marginal, increasing marginal returns to scale, but only gradually, only incrementally. Whereas once you eliminate the marginal costs, then at once the returns to scale become potentially infinite. All you have is fixed costs, and then it becomes a pure volume game where the more you sell, the more you win. But there is a twist. If you've studied a little bit of economics 101, you may know that in a perfectly competitive market, the equilibrium price on the market tends to converge to the marginal cost of production. So in a world where marginal cost of production go down to zero, prices will go down to zero as well. And so the equilibrium price on digital markets in many circumstances will end up to zero, which explains why many services are free online in general. And so you have this idea that digital products and services are sort of an immaterial thing that grows in sort of a vacuum. That's why I represent it here in a cloud, not just as a reference to cloud computing, but more generally to the idea that this is like completely immaterial. And this comes with a promise of abundance. If you look at the gurus in the Silicon Valley, their promise, including with this vision of the singularity at some point provoked by the technology, is we are heading towards a world of complete abundance, unlimited supply of whatever you want, because we grow in something that is entirely immaterial. And so that potentially could apply to AI services as well. That's why the basic versions of Copilot and ChatGPT and the like are free to use in the first place. But of course, I look at you here in the room and I readily see that you're like becoming skeptical and say, yeah, but these services cost a lot actually to run. Yeah, that's because there is a huge imposture, of course, in this space, which is the immateriality of these services hides, of course, the very concrete, the very capitalistic, the very material nature of the infrastructure that is required to operate these services. They include, of course, the infrastructure of data centers. Of course, you need chips, you need storage, you need networks, and you also need, for e-commerce, for instance, you also need a lot of logistics. And when you look at the size of these investments, you realize that this is actually staggering, and it's increasing extremely fast. If you only look at chips, you know that the unit cost of a foundry has been multiplied by a factor of nearly 20 over the past 20 years. This is the evolution of the cost of a foundry unit by Intel from 2000 to 2020, multiplied by 15 basically. And that means that the fixed cost that you need in order to keep producing these things is increasing very fast. And if you look, of course, at the investments behind the hyperscalers, this is a data center from Microsoft in Wyoming, I believe, just as an illustration, you see the size of these investments that are summarized here approximately in this table. Well, if you take the entire stack that is required to operate digital services, from chips and the money that is now being invested in the US and hopefully in Europe to have some more chips production in the US or in Europe, the investments in the data centers, the hyperscalers, and also cybersecurity of these infrastructures, the technology platforms themselves, the OSs, the social nets, and now the LLMs, etc. The satellite networks that increasingly become important, the submarine cables, and finally the logistics platform of Amazon, to take only that one. If you look at the amounts that have been invested by big tech companies in the US over the past 10 years, you end up with a number that is close to $1,500 billion, whereas the equivalent in Europe is only a tiny fraction of that. Now, of course, things are moving a little bit. On the one hand, you see that Amazon and Microsoft alone are investing over $50 billion a year in their AI computing infrastructure. You see that Meta and Google are following course, that OpenAI has big plans in this respect. You also see that now you have the Stargate project that was announced, $500 extra billion of investments for AI in the US alone. And finally, some announcement in Europe as well. Macron, 109 billion euros this time, 200 billion announced by von der Leyen as well on AI infrastructure and all of the ecosystem. I'm still willing to believe that, but I'll believe it once I really see the money. But nonetheless, even if you look at those updated numbers, you still end up with a gap, an investment gap between Europe and the US that is in over $1,500 billion. So that's a lot of money that we sort of forgot to invest in these essential infrastructures. And the problem is that these infrastructures, of course, are running very heavily on economies of scale. On top of it, you still need human resources in the loop. If you want to develop LLMs, for instance, you still need the experts who can do that. You need the brains. And we know that with the reinforcement learning part and the alignment, you need a lot of cheap work as well, cheap labor to fine-tune the models as well. So you need exploitable human resources to a certain scale, at least in these early stages of AI as well. And last but not least, you need a lot of energy. You certainly know that computing is energy intensive, and it gets to running or training models on NVIDIA chips. I just made a very simple back of the envelope calculation. NVIDIA sold 3.5 million units of H100 chips in 2023 alone, considering that they're being used 60% of the time in the course of a year. It means that in order to just power these chips sold in a single year, you would need one of the reactors in Tihange to just run those chips. No wonder, therefore, why all of the big tech companies are now significantly investing or considering investing in nuclear power plants and other decarbonized energy sources. They just need a lot of energy to run these. And then I go back to my introduction. Yeah, we were promised that the internet would be a world free of big intermediaries and big players. That was the promise, and we thought that the internet would lower the barriers to entry on markets, that it would become very easy to enter new markets because you were free of those big capitalistic investments. Yeah, that was at the beginning, but instead we end up with very heavy infrastructures, probably the largest infrastructures ever built by humanity for as far as we can go back in history, at least in terms of monetary investments. And so these are actually huge barriers to entry potentially, and AI is only making things even worse given the size of the investments needed on the compute and storage side. So you do have economies of scale, and that's the number two mechanism here in the traditional sense and in the sense of capitalistic barriers. Now, on top of this, the ecosystem is completely worthless if you don't have a way to touch the consumers, to touch the end users. So you need the interfaces. The user interface is on the one hand, so that you can put all of these services and technologies in the hand of everybody, citizens, companies, consumers, you name it. And you also need the interfaces toward external developers who would like to capitalize on these services, on these generic services to build custom-made stuff. And so that's why you, on the one hand, have the user interfaces, on the other hand, you have the programming interfaces, the software interfaces that enable third parties to build complementary innovation on top of the ecosystems. And this last layer, this interface layer, it runs very heavily on network effects because these are essentially platforms. These are basics, components of technology that you can use to either facilitate interaction or to build complementary innovation. So you enter the world of platforms, of two-sided markets like Uber or Airbnb, where you don't just have one app, but you actually have two. You have one for the drivers and one for the passengers. And what you need is that you need those two sides of the platform to actually be there for the platform to be valuable. What is extremely peculiar to these platform economics is the fact that the value of the platform, the value of the product, does not come from the platform or the product itself. It mainly comes from the usage of the platform, which is very different to the way traditional products and services work. If you think of, I don't know, a leisure park, for instance, an entertainment park, go to Walibi, for instance, if there are a lot of people at Walibi, the experience degrades. The more people there are using the service, generally, the worse the experience gets. longer queues, and that degrades the experience. But with digital platforms, it's quite the opposite. The more usage you have, the more valuable the service and the platform becomes. So that's very agglomerative, and that's why I like, with especially consumer platforms, to use the image of a black hole. Once you have a platform that is big enough to really activate those network effects, it becomes like a black hole that captures all of the activity around it. That's why strategy takes a very different shape from what is traditionally taught in business schools, including mine. In traditional strategy, what we teach is that you have first to understand what is the category in which you operate, and those categories tend to be sharply and neatly defined. And within this category, what you need to do is to build sort of a protected market niche where you can be sort of protected from competition. And the two main tools you're going to use for that is cost leadership or product differentiation. And then you are going to own some key resources that will enable you to leverage these two potential strategies. So you focus on what you do best, and you try to get an exclusive grasp on the key resources. But with platforms and with digital models in general, it's quite different. The name of the game is to activate the network effect. So what you need is to create these feedback loops between the different sides of your user base so that you start creating sustainable value. The second thing that you need to take into account is that the categories are not neatly defined anymore. They're overlapping. The boundaries are getting blurred because, for instance, even the two sides are not mutually exclusive. The consumers can become the producers, as is the case in social networks, for instance. But even your competitors can become your complementers, as when Google Chrome, for instance, or Google Maps is available on the Apple platforms, and vice versa. So competition and complementarity become two sides of a medal, and competition shifts more to 3D, like 3D chess. It becomes multi-layered and multi-dimensional with new types of relationships that were completely ignored in traditional strategy, as it has been taught for decades. And last but not least, you no longer need to own sort of the inimitable resources. Quite on the contrary, you need to have those complementary and essential resources for your ecosystem join your ecosystem and orchestrate them rather than own them fully. So you have to get used to the idea that value is no longer something that you as a company can create on your own, but something that you need to enable others to create thanks to your products and services. Are we back? Yeah. And so value is now co-created by the platform and the users and complementers. But as a side effect, users get locked in because once every user is on the same platform, it's very hard to shift. And once the platform has fully captured the audience, then consumption converges toward this reduced set of interfaces. And once you control the interface, you control distribution, and then you can expand the scope of the platform. And that leads me to mechanism number 4, which is economies of scope. Once you have the ecosystem, once you have the platform, once you own the interface, it's very easy and natural, almost irresistible for a platform to expand its activities to new fields. And big tech companies have already shown the way for a number of years now. All right, but now there's the 5th mechanism, which is potentially the most powerful one, and that, of course, involves the data. Once you own the ecosystem, and especially the user interface, then you master also access to contextual data that is captured by the user interface. And these contextual data are super important, not just because they feed the services themselves until they are finally brought back into the data centers and the infrastructure, but they're also used to train the new models, for instance. They're also used to improve the quality of the service, and they're essentially feeding what we call organizational learning. So once you have access to these data streams, you have access to a resource that is quite unique, which echoes the way capitalism 101 tends to work. Capitalism in its traditional form is about the appropriation of the means of production. Essentially, it's the privatization of the commons that forms the essence of capitalism. The core of the capitalistic machine in a world of atoms is what? You need to get a grasp, to get a hand on the land, the tools, and work. So the resources that you need to produce something, and you combine this using some sort of technology. That's how you produce products, and that's how you can finally bring them to the market. Which means that in the traditional capitalistic world, competition focuses on the resources themselves, land, tools, work, and on innovation, which is technology. So it's a fight over the resources, and it's a fight over continuous innovation, which are finally the means of production that you need to intensify. Now, how does it turn in the digital world, knowing this inner working of the entire ecosystem? And that's the way Shoshana Zuboff presents it, and I think it's a very powerful way to think about the way this new capitalism works. You have digital products and services, you bring them to the market, but they are going to capture contextual and behavioral information. And this information is going to feed what I call machine intelligence, which is the algorithms, which is all of the mechanisms you have in place to essentially tailor-made, personalize, and pick up the services that the users want. And machine intelligence is going to use the data to improve the products and services in the first place. That's a very powerful feedback loop. But then you can create new markets. With this data, there is something new that's coming up that we have been observing for the past 20 years, which is once you have so accurate data and so detailed information about the consumers, you can make predictions about their behaviors, and you can therefore create a new market for those predictions, or go one step further and even start, as Google is doing, selling the clicks, not just the potential audience. In this case, what you're actually selling is a modification of behavior. It's the fact that somebody is actually clicking on a certain link, and you are starting to sell an actual behavior and being retributed for the actual behavior of the consumer. So that is a very different engine, but it boils down again to the same idea, that you need to fight over the resources. Only those resources now are more and more about the data, the contextual and personal data, and you need to fight over the innovation, which focuses now on this general idea of machine intelligence and influencing the behaviors. That's where data is essential. It will not just create these new markets or enable the creation of the new markets, but it will also essentially feed this organizational learning, enabling firms to become more and more relevant. And it is also key to ensuring the comfort of the experience and the personalization of the services for the user. So it contributes to locking the users in. So here's my take. If you want to understand digital economics in a nutshell, it boils down to those 5 core mechanisms: the zero marginal cost that enable scaling without investing in the mass, but at the same time, the fact that you actually do need a certain mass, which is the infrastructure that runs these services, which runs really heavily on economies of scale in the traditional sense. But on the user side, what you have is economies of scale on the user side. We call them network effects, with all of this idea of empowerment of the users and co-creation of the value. Then you have economies of scope, the idea that platforms are very generic and can be expanded quite easily to new services. And finally, organizational learning, which is the way of capturing value from the data. These are very different recipes from traditional strategy, from the way traditional economics work, and they have a number of implications. The first one is that actually, contrarily to this fake promise of abundance and unlimited supply of whatever, you do need massive infrastructure, and AI is only making things worse in this respect. Chips, data centers, energy, networks, logistics, you name it. The combination of capital, very intensive on the infrastructure side, network effects, and data create a a very powerful agglomerative force that pushes towards concentration of economic value and economic power, which means it's very, very hard to play small with under these rules, and you generally need very large volumes to make it work. That means that growth becomes far more important than profits in the short run, which means that you can only build these models with unlimited access to capital, to financial capital, something that Europe, of course, is very, very bad at providing, as we know. But you still need the brains and the exploitable work for all of what we call the bullshit jobs associated to the gig economy in general. And at the same time, the very schizophrenic relationship that tech companies have to human work is that they need it badly, including in the very old-fashioned sense of exploitable workforce for the nasty work that nobody really wants to see, like moderating contents on social media or reinforcing the learning of the algorithms. But at the same time, they want to get rid of that as much as possible, because the moment you have any manual input into a certain process, you lose the advantage of immaterial economics and zero marginal costs. So the end of the game is normally once you get rid of every potential human intervention in the loop, and that's why regulation, of course, is fully contradictory to that, because regulation wants human back in the loop. We'll talk about that later. But that means, at the end of the day, that value is created in a far more dynamic way than it used to be. It's co-created, and it's characterized by 4D relationships within these environments, which creates a huge challenge for regulation, especially of competitive conduct as well. That means, actually, when you take the integral of all of these peculiarities of digital economics, you realize that digital markets cannot be fully competitive. And you are almost necessarily unavoidably pushed in a situation where the winner takes all or almost all. So you end up, if not with a monopoly, with an ugly oligopoly of 2-3 dominant firms on every market with very complex interdependencies. That's my sketch of what essentially makes the digital economy different from traditional economy. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there are always two sides to the medal, and the ethicists of the technology generally tell you upfront that with technology you cannot have only the good side or the bad side. You only get you always get the two. As a matter of fact, from an econ point of view, there are good sides and bad sides, of course, to these agglomerative forces and concentration in particular. On the one hand, you end up with superstar firms, as we call them, the ones that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which to some extent are profiting from the fact that they are essentially more efficient than the others. There is evidence that quality is there, that innovation is quite vivid on digital markets, despite the existence of these mammoth firms, whereas generally competitive economics tell you that the main disadvantage of competition, of monopolistic markets, is that you end up with less innovation. Here, nobody would really complain about slow innovation in digital, I think. At the same time, users are super happy generally with the convenience that is provided by those services. That's why they're very addictive, by the way. Many of those services, you don't even pay for them. And so there are lots of reasons to believe that those markets, even highly concentrated, are not as badly functioning as one might guess. But of course, on the other hand, to some extent, this concentration also results not just from superior efficiency, but also from predatory behaviors, which include, in a nutshell, market confiscation, third-party data abuse, self-preferencing, and predatory pricing, things that are on the radar of regulators. The problem is that these things look very familiar to regulators, whereas they actually, the underlying mechanisms are very, very different. To go very fast on the upside, first, there are lots of reasons to believe that markets are still quite dynamic and to some extent contestable. This includes the speed at which innovation keeps accruing, the speed at which some of the markets are being reshuffled. In 2007, everybody believed that Nokia was unbeatable on the mobile phone market, only to be eclipsed by Apple and later by Samsung itself. Even on social networks, there is some movement. And there are a lot of evidence also that success is not guaranteed. It's not automatic for the big tech companies. They also fail quite massively, and the graveyard of failed projects within the big tech companies is quite populated. Like I said, some of those services, many of those services are free. You don't pay for WhatsApp or for Google Search, for instance, and you have access to basic versions of most of the services. And one of the key arguments is that targeting and micro-targeting is super efficient, and that would give an undue advantage to those firms who have access to your personal information. But if we are being fully honest, how efficient is really micro-targeting? Studies in marketing and in advertising actually increasingly converge to the idea that micro-targeting misses the target more often than it does not. And so the idea is that these things are actually overestimated at some point, and innovation is quite heavy and sustained. Now, of course, the other push toward these big firms is that we are very complacent praise for them. We are very happy to be addicted to those services, especially when we don't pay for them. And this makes us, of course, very easy praise for big firms. So if we are victims somehow, we are voluntary victims of those. Now, of course, like I said, on the other side, you do have some toxic behaviors. And there is this idea that we should apply, from a regulatory standpoint, we should apply the duck test to those big tech firms. The idea being, while they can say, the Googles and the Apples and the Microsoft and the like, they can say whatever they want about the dynamism of the markets and the contestability of the markets and their efficiency and the fact that consumers have a choice and blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, if they look like ugly monopolies, we should treat them like ugly monopolies. And that's sort of the pushback that you have observed, especially in the US and increasingly in Europe as well, at least up to January of this year, when the administration completely changed in the US, and it's becoming very hard to read where this is going. But on the radar of the competition authorities were clearly things like auto-preferencing, that is represented by some of these arrows here. The idea that once you own the platform, but also some products or services on the downstream market, it's very tempting to, of course, favor your own downstream applications rather than those of your competitors. You know that there is a lot of discussion about the exclusive contracts, why Google has been paying so much money to Apple, its competitor at the end of the day, to change at the end of the day what is just a single setting, being the default search engine on the Apple ecosystem. The cost ended up around $20 billion a year for Google. Why is Google paying so much money? That's a big question. Google says, I'm just retributing my distributor. That's only normal thing. In every industry, you will see something like this. But at some point, it's also paying for some exclusivity, for some defaults. And research shows that default settings are extremely sticky in the world of digital. You also sometimes overlook the fact that sometimes the problem is not so much on the demand side as it is on the supply side. The fact that you are actually a provider that is in sort of a monopolistic situation for upstream players, and that is illustrated by the very dominant position of Google or Meta versus the media, the traditional media, or Amazon versus the book publishers, for instance. There is a distribution of power power that is totally asymmetric there. It is not so much about a monopoly, because Amazon is not a provider of the publishers. It's actually quite the opposite, but it's the one of the main market gates. And that's why we have in the DMA this core idea of the gatekeepers. Being a gatekeeper gives you not monopoly power, but monopsony power. So what is regulation doing? Well, it would be a lie to pretend that the regulators have not taken notice, that there is a problem, but what can they do? If you only look at the competitive side, what they can do essentially is look at M&A operations, and that's the only instance in which they can intervene anticipatively. They can, of course, and must intervene when there is evidence of market power abuse and when there is evidence of collusion and cartels. The case of collusion and cartels with digital markets is not the biggest deal. It's not that it's not happening. You know these cases of Apple and Adobe and others actually making a hidden deal to not steal employees from one another, which is totally illegal and has been sanctioned. Apple was also convicted for making a deal with some book publishers. It was actually in retaliation to Amazon's predatory pricing towards the publishers, but nonetheless, it was still illegal. But this is not, by and large, the main problem we have. One of the biggest issues is about M&A operations. There are a lot of M&A activity by big tech firms. If you only look at the 5 largest, the so-called GAFAMs, 400 M&A operations were counted from 2010 to 2020. Only a tiny fraction of those were actually even analyzed by the antitrust authorities, like WhatsApp and Instagram were not even looked at in detail, simply because they were below the threshold that raised normally a red flag. But now, since 2020, like I said, you see some more aggressiveness on the regulatory side to try to block some M&A operations, which didn't preclude Microsoft from acquiring Activision a couple of years ago. And finally, on the market power abuse side, you see that fines have been piling up, especially for Microsoft and Google. And you have a lot of other pending cases, both in the US and in Europe. Of course, in the US, there was this huge question about what we call trial of the century for Google, both on the ad market and the OS and Chrome market. So for search and for ads and Chrome, etc. But no one really has a clue how these cases are actually going to evolve now that the heads of the FTC has been replaced. And so there's a big question mark in Europe as well as to what will be the position of Europe now that the power has been quite heavily reshuffled in between the US and Europe. But then that's only about competition. There is also a lot of concern about fundamental rights like privacy. And now we, of course, know all that we have the GDPR. Now, when it goes to AI, we have the AI Act, we have the Data Act, we have a lot of regulation. I'll come back to that. But if you look only at our private data, can we be fully reassured now that we have the GDPR? Knowing that the data brokers have never made more money nowadays than they've made in history, including before the GDPR, and nobody has ever heard of those companies like Experian or Axiom. So in a study that we conducted with my team and Ipsos for the European Commission 2 years ago, we surveyed 10,000 firms in Europe to try to understand where they get their data from. And we noticed that about 13% of firms in Europe across industries and sizes actually actively use data from data brokers. And if you look at large firms, especially in the financial industry, so banking and insurance, for instance, it gets closer to 30% of firms, so 1 in 3 firms that are actually using data coming from data brokers. Probably none of you here or online have ever officially or formally consented to Experian actually selling data from you to those players. So it looks like regulation is there, and there is a big push from the regulatory side, especially in Europe, but it doesn't seem to be super efficient. Big tech is still as powerful as ever, and our privacy does not seem to be so well protected nowadays. So why is it so? In short, because it tends to be very slow, because it still applies the recipes of the past to a functioning of markets that has fundamentally changed, and because potentially it doesn't pursue the right objective. In this respect, when it comes to antitrust, there are two ways to look at antitrust issues. The original vision presiding the Sherman Act and the very roots, the very origins of antitrust in the US was very structuralist. The idea was not that we should only intervene when consumers are harmed, but only when market power is too strong. The idea is that concentration is bad of itself, and that therefore the main objective of antitrust is to ensure that there is high competitive intensity and that markets remain contestable. Whereas the Chicago view that has become fully dominant since the years of Thatcher and Reagan, both in Europe and in the US, has focused on efficiency, which is a narrower view of competition which focuses on consumer surplus. So long as the consumers benefit at the end of the day and are not being harmed or abused, then essentially market authorities shouldn't do anything about them. And when consumers actually don't pay for a lot of services, it's very hard to claim that they're being harmed, at least from a financial point of view. So there is this push now to the Harvard School, especially there has been such a push under Lina Khan at the FTC, for instance. But again, Lina Khan is now out of the equation, so God knows how this is going to unfold now in the US and how this is going to unfold in Europe. But the idea of a comeback to Harvard was, let's go back to the idea that markets need to be competitive and contestable in the first place. And so the problem with that is if you enforce that view quite aggressively, consumers might end up actually paying more. You might kill the market power of one firm only to see it being replaced by another one. Look at Microsoft's antitrust issues at the end of the 90s, gave rise actually to a full domination on the smartphone market by Google, essentially. And actually, the markets and the technology move so fast, whereas antitrust takes years, that at the end of the day, you have a big chance of missing the target anyhow. And complementarity makes things very, very difficult. So there is this big question: is the solution to break up big tech companies? It's unsure. Of course, it would in the short run improve competition, but it would potentially create new monopolies. And you have to keep in mind, especially when you think of social media and AI, etc., what would be the result of fiercer competition? Would it push Meta to be more moral, more ethical in its behavior and its moderation, or would it, on the contrary, push Meta to be even more aggressive in using manipulative techniques to keep people addicted to its services? So thereby, should we create new rules? And I will end up here. Essentially, in Brussels, in Europe, there is this view that we innovate on the regulatory side, and then we inspire the entire world with our innovative regulation. That's what we call the Brussels effect. But let's keep in mind that the European legislator has been extremely prolific in the field of digital, and certainly AI more recently, whereas there is this idea that changing the law is something that one shouldn't be doing, if only with a trembling hand, when it's once it is only very much necessary. There is evidence that regulation is not always only having upsides, it always have negative effects. For instance, regulation, think of the GDPR, think of the AI Act, is adding administrative costs to every firm, but these costs are more problematic for smaller firms than it is for larger firms. We also know that there are many cases in which regulation ends up benefiting especially the incumbents, and even the unbundling of services might end up being harming the consumers and reinforcing the big tech companies. One of the reasons behind that is because of regulatory capture. If you write new regulation, but you let big technology firms actually inspire or dictate some of the elements in the regulation, of course, it ends up regulating it. This is why I'm certainly not advocating for no regulation. I don't think deregulated market in digital would be such a good idea, but I do believe that there is a lot more potential for steering steering digital markets in the direction that we want by creating the future waves of innovation and pulling the markets in the direction that we want, rather than trying to regulate something that is built by others. Which is why my plea is for Europe to certainly invest in its sovereignty, which is both a matter of infrastructure, of course, but it's also a matter of developing its own way. I don't think the future of Europe is to build a new Facebook, and I don't think we need a new European Facebook. I don't think that Europe needs to rebuild the equivalent of the hyperscalers in the US. I think we need to play the game with our own rules and in our own way, with models that probably need to be smarter than just running on crazy amounts of compute. And we need probably to find ways to build infrastructure that is federated, that is maybe virtualized, rather than relying on monolithic players. But I think all of that is achievable. The one thing that I'm more worried about is about the ability of European markets and investors, for that matter, to invest in the marketing that is required to attract sufficiently large user bases. And it will all depend on our ability to get our ideas clear on what we want to achieve with digital. In Europe, we want it all. We want a greener Europe and a green air and a nice environment. We want competitive markets. We want fundamental rights to be protected. And we want, at the same time, to regain our sovereignty and industrial development in Europe. And I don't think there is a magic or silver bullet that will enable to do it all. I think every piece of regulation that pushes in one direction is slowing us back in another dimension. If you look at the US and China, they're very clear on what they want. In the US, they focused mainly on industrial development, sovereignty, and supremacy on the technology side. In China, it's pretty much the same, only they also care a lot about controlling and restricting fundamental rights. But I think the answer for Europe will be to be very clear on what we really want to do. And I think, and it's probably a nice introduction to the panel that will ensure that education is the only sure bet we can make to enable us to finally see something like this, that no, Germany is not always winning in football, Belgium, or replace Belgium with Europe and Germany with the US, and you pretty much get the idea. Last but not least, but that's maybe a way to introduce some of the questions you might have, and sorry for being a bit slower than I promised. I think we need to be worried about the idea that we are increasingly becoming the tools of our own tools, and we need to think about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. You've described the dynamics of a digital economy, how AI and generative AI has changed the game.
Yep, it's an excellent question. I think it's, on the one hand, it's fully accelerating the phenomenon because of its massive requirement in terms of infrastructure. The fact that training the models, but even inference, is requiring so much compute makes it even more important and interesting to scale these infrastructures. So it gives the big players an even bigger advantage. So it might, at first hand, push towards even more concentration because of that. On the other hand, you have something that is sort of potentially reshuffling the user side. And the big question mark, and unfortunately there are two very different trajectories for that. The key issue is going to be who's going to hold the customer interface of these tools. One possibility is that the APIs win the battle, and at the end of the day, the user interface does not need to converge to only one or two main interfaces, but rather have a possibility of integrating these services everywhere. And in that case, that would reduce the power of those who own the end-user interfaces. But you see already with Microsoft's push to integrate every possible new wave of AI into its 365 suite, you see that the idea is really to keep the hand on the consumer interface and be the unique distribution point of the services. And that, I think, is going to be the main battle, even more importantly than the infrastructure.
Yeah, thank you. And can you comment on the business model of all these new generative AI companies and LLMs that are coming. So.
Yeah, thanks. It's another very good question. The one thing that we saw with digital models so far, especially for the past 20 years, is that what was very, very costly was to reach a sufficient user base. Once you got the user base and you captured the users on your interface or on your platform, then monetizing it becomes very, very easy. And so it was only a matter of growing fast enough on the user side. Now, if you look at ChatGPT, it has been growing faster than any other model in the past of any other digital innovation. I think the numbers nowadays around 400 million active weekly users reported by ChatGPT, which is massive. But they're losing $1 billion every month. So they're losing a lot of money despite having already acquired the user base. If you look at Microsoft, Nadella recently admitted they have invested about $200 billion in their AI efforts, infrastructure, but models and interfaces so far. And the turnover that they've gained from that so far has only been around 13 billion. So at the moment, it's a massive loss. And so that seems to be quite different. And I think it has to do, again, with the size of the investments that are required. When you think that Microsoft and Amazon alone invest 100 billion in their AI infrastructure every year, you have to realize that this is pretty much the size of the investment of the International Space Station. So if you need an International Space Station on your own to be able to run the models, to train and run the models, then of course, it's very hard to predict what is the size of the volume of usage that you will need in order for that to become monetizable at some point. And there are two different directions there. One is the Microsoft push to just force-feeding the services into the existing customer base and increasing the prices in the meantime, what we may have experienced as family owner users of 365 with a 30% increase in price in exchange for something you didn't ask for, which is Copilot in Office. And then you have the OpenAI approach, which is let's find the niche markets that are willing to pay a fortune for the extra models, like the idea of selling deep research for like 20,000 euros or even more on a subscription basis. So that means that you see that now it's becoming the moment of truth for when are those models becoming profitable and at what price for the consumers. If the price is too heavy, you forget about the volumes and you're dead. If the price is too low, given the size, you will need a volume that is gigantic. And at the end of the day, the bet behind this, because the only way to read those massive investments by big tech on AI is to understand it as a poker bet. It's a gamble. And the idea behind the gamble is that the productivity gains are going to be so massive that usage is going to be multiplied by 1,000 or 1,000,000. And so it's not so much on the training side, but really on the inference side that you will actually have massive usage. And that's the bet that Nadella is acknowledging himself. But it's no more than a bet. And he recently said himself, the proof will be in the pudding. It's once our economies will start growing at 10% a year, then we will finally have the evidence that it was worth the while. We are still far from it.
Okay, so you are not convinced that LLMs, generative AI, could increase the productivity, and we should bet on it?
I believe it's going to take a lot more time than we anticipate. I think there are big changes ahead, structural changes to the way work is performed and value is created. But I think we're only scratching the surface of these things. And because we tend to be in a microcosm that works at the frontier of technology and business models, we tend to extrapolate what we see in our bubble to the entire economy. But the mass of the economy worldwide is actually much slower and lower tech than we believe, and far less able to really reap the benefits of the technology overnight. And so I believe in the bulk of the economy, it is going to take a lot more time, also because the organizational inertia is far stronger than we assume. So I anticipate that this is going to come only a lot slower than people claim. And because of that, the question is, are we going to still make those models livable, sustainable for the operators until it starts really paying off? That's the $200 billion question.
Thank you. Is there some question in the room? Yes? Yeah, we have time for one question or
Hello,
two.
thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry, it's okay? Yeah. What do you think about the Digital Market Act with the obligation of interoperability? I think it's a good way to obligate platform to exchange our data, and I think it's a good idea. In my opinion, it's the only way to create a new competitor, something like that, and transparency for algorithm, because it's in the Digital Market Act too. So regulation could be a good way to obligate some platforms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question and for the hint. I fully concur with you that the most powerful leverage that the regulatory body has is on interoperability indeed, pushing also for open source solutions and certainly for transparency on every level. You just have to keep in mind that those things are not super compatible at first sight. They are not super compatible with ensuring privacy. Somehow your data is better stored in a place where you know it's not going to be interoperable with nobody. Once you open the gate and the flows, you also incur the risk that your data is going to flow even more massively across the ecosystem. But that's probably the price to pay for regaining some from reopening, rebattling, reshuffling the cards here. So I fully agree, interoperability is absolutely key. And the fact that we're stuck with the idea that if you use WhatsApp, you can only send messages to WhatsApp users, it's completely nonsensical. I'm pretty sure in 10 years from now, we'll look at that and say, how stupid have we been to consider that it was okay to have a platform that was closed like this. And so yes, we need to open up the platforms, and enforcing and interoperability is probably the best weapon we have. I agree with you.
There is a question online. We have time for one question.
Okay, so we have a question online. So Harari has suggested that information or data could function as a form of currency in the digital economy. How valid is this idea, and what are the implications for the economy?
Haha. It's a great question. Yeah, the elephant in the room is that everybody seems to be happy with the idea that we don't pay, but we all know that when we don't pay for a service because we pay with some other currency, and generally we pay with our data. And actually the data is valuable to the companies, otherwise they wouldn't offer you the services for free. And so therefore the question is, why don't we get paid for this? That's the core idea behind it. By the way, it already is the case. Google doesn't pay you for your data for sure, but Microsoft does. If you're a Bing user, you gain reward points, and with those reward points, you can actually go to actual stores, to real stores, and then redeem the coupons that you get. So you somehow get real money in exchange for your search, for your searches on Bing. So Microsoft is willing to pay you something, not a fortune, but something for the data and for helping them actually improve their search engine. So there is some logic behind the idea that we should be retributed for the data, for the information. The technology potentially is there to do that. The question is, what is going to be the trigger, knowing that you have very concentrated power on the one side, which are the platforms, and very diluted power on the consumer side. So it's a very unequal game. And so when consumers don't have a lot of choice, it's hard for them to enforce being retributed for something. So the challenge, I think, is not so much technological. There have been ideas around the blockchain. I mean, the whole idea of Brave and other initiatives is really to have those mechanisms to retribute you for your data in cryptocurrencies, for instance. But I think the issue is not technical. The issue is mainly how do we force the larger players to adjust their business models and to come up with the idea that the work that you provide to them, not just with your data, but by clicking on a search link or by liking something or by commenting on something, it's all inputs from you that you provide to them, that you supply to them, and that you should be paid for that. And that's where competition might help, because the more competitive markets are, the more initiatives you will see, like Microsoft Rewards and stuff like that, to make users expect to be paid for that.
Thank you very much, Nicolas.
Thank you very much for the invitation again.
And we, at 12:15, we'll begin the debate on how to get trained in AI. So maybe that is the bet that Europe should do on talent.
Absolutely.
So let's see. you back on 12:15.
Thank you.